All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. Just a couple of housekeeping tips before we get started here. To ask questions at any point, you can raise your hand and that will put you in the queue. And then at that point, we'll go ahead and let you know when you can unmute yourself to ask a question. Also, if you're speaking, please do mute yourself when you're not speaking. Teams does sometimes have an echo, so that helps to mitigate against it. So with that, I'll hand it over to Commissioner Grove.
Great, thanks, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. Thanks for joining us. We're going to cut right to the chase. We've got a lot to share, and we know there are questions out there too. The purpose of this conversation really is to just walk through the guidance for large venues, which kicks into gear on April 1st, so just a little over a week away. I'm joined today by my colleagues in state government, Ben Wood from the Department of Labor and Industry, Laura Olivan from the Department of Health, and Mitch Perry from the Department of Health is here too, just in case there's additional questions on vaccines or anything vaccination related. Wanted to have Mitch here too to answer those questions. I'd say in addition to raising your hands for questions, feel free to use that chat bar as well. We can answer questions over text if they're easier to chat into Microsoft Teams. Although, of course, if you'd like to speak, we'd love to hear from you too. So I'm going to turn it right away over to Ben Wood from the Department of Labor. He's going to kind of go over the large venue guidance in whole, and then mostly looking forward to answering the questions that you might have about it. This is new terrain for us at the state and for our large venues, but we're excited about it and really excited to see many of your venues up and running again here soon as we proceed with this economic recovery. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, as the Commissioner alluded to, I think the announcement a couple of weeks ago was a large step to allow a lot of venues and a lot of businesses out there to take advantage of, particularly a lot of their operations that afford them a lot of space and a lot of square footage. So when the guidance was published, there were obviously a lot of nuances, I think, that had yet to be clarified, which we're hoping to do today. So just to kind of get right into the presentation itself, the original executive order 2111 basically identified that large venues could now increase their capacity, as well as some other venues such as gyms and restaurants. Everybody as of March 15th were basically able to operate with the 50% rated occupant capacity with up to 250 people. Now, beginning on March 31st, April 1st, what venues with rated occupant capacity greater than 500 will be able to do is add additional occupancy above and beyond that initial 250 people that they would get. And the number of people that a venue would be able to have or add on to that would be based on whether or not they're an indoor occupancy or an outdoor occupancy, and a seated occupancy or a non-seated occupancy. And again, there's a lot of venues out there that basically will fit into one of those four buckets. But we do have a number of venues out there that are a lot more complex and maybe require a little bit of a hybrid approach, or maybe answering some nuances in terms of, well, what if my venue is both inside and outside? What if my venue consists of both indoor and outdoor, as well as some cap issues? So the essence of probably what's already been covered in the guidance up at this point is just recognizing that non-seated indoor venues can have an additional 10% of the capacity over 500. Seated indoor and non-seated outdoor can afford themselves an additional 15%, and then seated outdoor venues would be able to take advantage of 25%. The maximum capacities of whatever's been identified for the venue apply for the entire venue. So at this point, venues are not able to carve themselves up or divide themselves up in any manner that take them above what these max capacities are right now. So an indoor non-seated venue has a max capacity of 1,500, indoor as 3,000 if you're seated, and then outdoor spaces are up to 10,000. The other thing, and this is a common question, I've been engaged with a number of you over the last couple of weeks. Many of you will find that we're using the calculations, but we still have some issues with social distancing. you do have to reduce the number of people that you're allowing in the venue if people can't be effectively social distance. So that is kind of a nuance with the guidance. It's what's to expect. So most venues are going to have to kind of assess what's going on in their environment. We've provided kind of a couple of tools available on the website, the Stay Safe Minnesota website, for helping venues understand what their max capacity is. And essentially, it offers 3 questions. It identifies, are you indoor or outdoor, if you are seated or non-seated, and then it asks you what your rated capacity is for the space that you're using. And then that will basically, once you kind of put in those 3 components, it will identify what your max cap is. If you don't have a rated occupancy, and what we're talking about are either venue spaces that are outdoors, or maybe structures that aren't really designed for occupancy. So if you think about a barn, or you think about a large warehouse, or you think about like an airplane hangar or something like that, generally speaking, a lot of those types of structures won't have occupancy. So this is where the 113 square feet per person comes in. The 113 square foot per person, generally speaking, is always going to be a lot more conservative than actually using your rated occupancy. So you always want to defer to your local officials to figure out what your occupancy is. With regards to calculating your occupancy, a couple of rules that are really important to remember. Number 1, workers do not count in your occupant capacity as long as the workers are at the venue for the purpose of functioning as their role, whether it be their job or a volunteer kind of serving to support the venue. But they do have to be working at the time. So if you're allowing employees to come to the venue outside of their work hours, they actually have to be identified as a patron. We also have the performer exemption, and the performer exception is basically recognizing that for a stadium, for example, the teams on the field do not count in terms of the capacity. If you're going to a theater, the performers on stage do not count as a performer as capacity. However, that is so long as the following conditions are met. Number 1, there needs to be a designated performance area. So if you have a field or a stage where the patrons at the venue do not, it's not accessible to them, and they're not interfacing with the performers or the players, then you can keep the performers basically separate and not count them as capacity. There always needs to be a 12-foot separation between the performance area and the patron area. So the stage needs to have a 12-foot gap. The playing field and the audience needs to have a 12-foot gap. And this is basically going to be no man's land. So this is going to be space within the venue that, the venue can't use to seat people, or can't be used to kind of allow people to go back and forth, except for maybe their workers, particularly when you're talking about security people or ushers and all of that stuff. The performers and patrons need to exit and enter the venue at different locations or separate locations. And then interaction between the performers and the patrons is not permitted. Now, many of you might be talking or thinking about graduation. A graduation ceremony, if you're contemplating saying the graduates, we want to count them as performers so they don't have to be counted in our capacity. You have to have the room for it, but the graduation ceremony has to be set up so the graduates never interface with their families or their parents for the duration while everybody's at the venue. And that's, that's really a decision point that some venues are going to have to make. If the designated performance area is within the general space of the facility and it takes up space where the occupant capacity is rated for, you have to reduce your rated occupant capacity by, depending on the amount of space or the number of people that are going to be occupying that performance area before you actually introduce the calculation. So if you have a gymnasium and you're cutting off 25% of the gymnasium, in order to kind of get more people in the room, your rated occupant capacity has to be reduced by 25% before you introduce it in the formula. And that's just in the interest of making sure we're not cramming or over cramming too many people into one space. Now, what if you're a seated venue? A seated venue is identified where every patron has an individually allocated, reserved, or assigned seat, which means if I'm going to go to a venue, I'm going to have my own place that I sit. It doesn't necessarily have to be issued in advance any longer. That was a requirement that was eliminated or basically reduced to a recommendation this last executive order. But when somebody gets there, the venue has to tell this person or their little group of 6 of people where they are, where they're assigned to. And this is for the purposes of making sure that, number one, the venue can proactively ensure that social distancing is established. And that if people are eating and drinking and needing to take their mask off, this is their own little area to do that with a seated venue. So, you don't have to have stadium seating. You can certainly allocate seating in terms of a space on the ground. You can allocate seating as a table of 6 or a table of 4. You can allocate seating as a bench or a row. But somehow each little group or each person needs to make sure they have their own space. The advanced seating is not required, but the other aspect about a seated venue is, generally speaking, patrons have to remain seated while they're in attendance. Can they get up and use the bathroom? Yeah. Can they get up to use concessions? Yeah. But the experience does not contemplate patrons kind of getting up and standing and commingling and walking around through the entire experience. So if you have a ball game at the stadium, for example, and people are seated, that could be a seated venue and you could take advantage of that capacity. But if people have seats, but generally speaking, throughout the venue, people are getting up and wandering around and commingling and sightseeing, that is no longer a seated venue. It's a non-seated venue for purposes of the guidance. Now, what happens if we have a seated and a non-seated scenario? Generally speaking, the overall cap for the venue is still going to apply. So, you're not going to be able to divide it. A venue's not going to be able to divide itself up for for an event of 1,500 and have a separate event of 1,500 and have a separate event of 1,500. The entire venue is going to be capped. What you can do is, if you have separate events where one is a seated venue and one is a non-seated venue, it used to be that if you have a non-seated venue, the entire venue is now non-seated, and that's no longer the case. What you can do is you can have separate events so long as the caps in the non-seated venues do not exceed 1,500, and the total cap of the entire venue does not exceed 3,000. So essentially, you could have 4 venues within a space, and 2 of those venues could be non-seated. One could be 750, one could be 750. That would allow a venue to have 2 additional seated venues at 750 each, but the entire venue would still be limited to 3,000. And again, the caveats is each one of those venues has to be entirely separate. So you can't allow your event spaces to commingle. So it's going to have they're each going to have separate entrances, separate facilities, separate concessions, and so on and so forth. And if you don't do that, then the entire venue if it has one venue that's non-seated, then the entire venue has to be non-seated. So the division allows a non-seated venue to coexist with a seated venue within kind of a larger venue, without without being limiting to just the non-seated cap. You can actually use the 3,000 max as long as you follow those requirements. Indoor and outdoor venues. So if you have an outdoor venue, as long as you have the space for it, you can have up to 10,000 patrons in the venue. And if you're an indoor seated venue, you can have 3,000. If you're an indoor non-seated venue, you can have 1,500. What do you do if you have a space that consists of both? Well, generally the entire footprint of the venue is going to establish what the cap is. And more often than not, we're going to be talking about an outdoor footprint. So if you look at an example like this, you have an outdoor footprint outside with 3 buildings. So what you cannot do at a venue is you cannot cumulatively add your max caps to get more people. The entire venue is going to be capped at 10,000 people. Now, if you have an indoor building within the outdoor space, the indoor building is going to be subjected to whatever the cap is. So if you have one building, then that building is going to have the 1,500 person cap for a non-seated venue, or a 3,000 person cap for the seated venue. If you have 2 buildings, those caps are actually going to apply cumulatively and in total between the 2 buildings, which means, number one, a venue can't have like a 10,000 cap for the outside and then add 1,500 or 3,000 for each building, resulting in a potential cap for, for 19,000 people. The entire venue is treated as one venue. There's 10,000 people for the venue, and then the venue has to control access into all of the buildings to make sure that the caps aren't exceeded for each building. So if you have 3 buildings, what you're not able to do is establish a separate cap for each building. The cap applies to all of the buildings in the sum total of what's going on. So preemptively, if a venue has 3 separate indoor spaces, they would take their 1,500 cap for if it's a non-seated venue and figure out how they're going to allocate that space in between all 3 venues. That's going to be the easiest way to approach this. You can actually have, assign people at the doors for each one of the venues and kind of count heads going in and going out. So at any given time at the venue, you can have up to 1,500 people indoors, but you will never have more than 10,000 people in attendance at the entire venue, indoor spaces and outdoor spaces together. The other thing that was added with regards to these requirements is, as a side note, if you're operating a venue, face coverings must be worn by all persons in attendance, whether it's indoors or outdoors, and may be removed if people are eating and drinking, as long as they're eating either in their assigned seat, if it's a seated venue, or an area that was designated by the venue if you're a non-seated venue. So again, this is just kind of one step in the process, but we do want to make sure that we focus on the fundamentals of making sure that masking and social distancing are really the key elements here. So if you are operating a venue, just making sure that those strategies are effectively communicated to your staff and everybody in attendance at the venue. And I guess at this point, I'll hand it back over to the commissioner for questions.
Great, thanks, Ben. Obviously, we're going to some of the complexities of mixed venues, which require some of these unique interpretations, but the broad principles remain pretty simple in terms of the overall caps and percentages, and it's just that indoor and outdoor, seated and non-seated component that defines the guidance. So I think with that, we'll turn it over to Jen Gates to moderate the Q&A, and we have both Ben on, of course, who you just heard from, but also our friend Laura Olivan from the Department of Health, who can go into any questions on either that presentation or even broader questions that you might have. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.